thanks to BlueHat for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So in this talk, we're going to dissect the malware and the techniques used within the malware by two very interesting APT groups that we've been focusing on for the past couple of years. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. That was a really cool video, so I don't need to talk about myself. Instead, I want to do a shout out to the whole ESET research team that's been tracking these adversaries and their malware. One of them who you had the chance to listen to yesterday, that's Zuzana, and this is also the work of other team members here. So this is the location where a lot of this research originates from. This is Houston in our ESET headquarters in Bratislava. That's one of them. We also have another lab in Montreal where the first piece of research comes from. So in this case study, rather than an overview of all the activities done by this APT group, I'm going to be focusing on one specific example of unique tradecraft. And that tradecraft is called LoJacks. Show of hands who heard about it, ring a bell. Okay, we have a couple of hands, that's cool. So it was the first UEFI rootkit we found in the wild. Now, this was a big deal for two main reasons. First, a UEFI rootkit is an extremely powerful persistence mechanism. And secondly, we found that it was used by one of the most infamous APT groups in operation today. Some of you might know what group I'm talking about. For the others, I'll build a little bit of suspense and reveal it a little bit later. So let's take a closer look at this discovery. The inspiration for the LoJacks malware comes from a legitimate piece of software called LoJack. Now, LoJack, previously also known as CompuTrace, is an anti-theft solution by Absolute Software that comes pre-installed on laptops from many different vendors. It has the functionality you would expect from an anti-theft solution, such as being able to locate, lock, or remotely wipe your device. But what makes it particularly interesting for our talk is its persistence mechanism. So this statement was taken from their own website, and it says that it's built into the BIOS or firmware during the manufacturing process of most major device manufacturers. We are able to provide our customers with the only security solution that can withstand a factory reset, installation of a new OS, or even a complete hard drive replacement. So that's pretty promising functionality, right? So this is the architecture of an older version of LoJack, if we take a look under the hood. And this is how it actually ensures that persistence. So first, there's the UEFI module. That's the part that comes pre-installed on the laptops. This is executed right after the computer is powered on, but before Windows starts. It'll copy a simple downloader called the small agent onto the Windows partition. Now, when Windows starts, the small agent is launched and then connects to a remote server to download the full agent and executes it. And the full agent is the component that's responsible, that contains the implementation of all that advertised LoJack anti-theft functionality. So this powerful persistence mechanism makes perfect sense for an anti-theft solution. I mean, without it, if a thief would be able to easily wipe the hard drive and get rid of it, it wouldn't be a very useful anti-theft solution now, would it? But this would also be very useful for an attacker, which is obviously what happened. So there was a vulnerability in this older version of LoJack, specifically in the LoJack small agent. Its configuration file contained the domain where it goes to download the full agent. And the problem was that attackers were able to simply replace this domain name with a malicious one, effectively transforming a legitimate persistent anti-theft tool into a very malicious, very persistent backdoor. So such samples were first discovered by Arbor Networks. We detect this Trojanized small agent as Win32/LoJacks. But naturally, we were interested in finding out if the attackers also went further earlier in all these steps and also compromised the UEFI part. So we decided to go on a hunt and started looking in our telemetry, eventually finding out that the answer was yes. So we discovered a very interesting APT campaign against government and diplomatic organizations in Europe. And on those computers, we found tooling of this APT group that we had been tracking for quite a while now. And in addition to those tools, we found some very interesting utilities, such as this one, info_EFI_exe. This is actually a benign custom tool, and its purpose is to extract a lot of information on about the system's hardware, including the UEFI firmware vendor and version. So this was kind of like the first sign that maybe a LoJack's UEFI rootkit might exist. Later, we found this other custom tool, rewriter_read_exe was what it was called, and the purpose of this one was to dump the entire content of the UEFI firmware memory. Now, that looks like a simple operation, but it's not. The tool has to talk to the SPI flash controller on a very low-level protocol, and that's a far from trivial thing to do. Now this all took some time, so later on, we were able to find this other utility, rewriter_binary_exe. And this is actually where we also found the UEFI rootkit component embedded inside. So hence the detection name for that one is EFI/LoJacks. Now this rewriter_binary_exe, what that does is it has code to add this embedded rootkit into the firmware image dumped by that previous tool, the rewriter_read_exe, and then to write this Trojanized image back to the target's firmware memory. So what does the UEFI rootkit, the LoJack's EFI rootkit, actually do? Well, although the implementation was far from trivial, from a high-level perspective, the functionality was pretty straightforward. Now, as is the first thing that starts running when you power up your computer before Windows starts, it had to load an NTFS driver to allow read and write operations. Afterwards, it would write the small agent, the Trojan Eyes small agent, that Win32/LoJacks component to the system partition, and then it would ensure its execution by patching the Windows registry. Now, after having discovered all of this, so this looked really interesting. So we found a UEFI rootkit, that a UEFI rootkit actually exists. But we were not entirely, still not entirely satisfied. We wanted to catch it in the act. So fortunately, we have a UEFI scanner as part of our endpoint protection platform. And later on, after the discovery of these files and looking into the telemetry from the UEFI scanner, we were able to find and actually confirm that this UEFI rootkit was actually actively being used in the wild. And we were able to attribute the attack to this infamous Sednit APT group, also known as Fancy Bear, APT28, or whatever's your favorite alias for this group, which I think needs absolutely no introduction. For this audience, this is the group behind many of the geopolitically motivated attacks, the DNC hack, and all of those. So, after having discovered this, UEFI rootkits are no longer merely a theoretical or proof of concept threat as they were before. They've been deployed against high-profile targets, but even if you're not a diplomat or a government employee, we can expect that this type of advanced tradecraft can be used by any dedicated attacker now against any organization actually worth the effort. If you're interested into more technical details, we have a white paper on it where you can find out more. Okay, so let's have a show of hands who's familiar or who has worked with MITRE ATT&CK in any way or form. Okay, quite a lot of you. In case there's anyone that's not familiar, it's basically a knowledge base of APT tactics and techniques, and also malware, so software names, and APT groups. So a really nice taxonomy and a knowledge base packaged all together. And we started mapping our threat research to MITRE ATT&CK about a year ago. One of the reasons for that being that it's nice to have a common language in order to be able to better communicate the results of our research. So LoJax is also featured there for a more high-level overview of the capability. You can also take a look there. Now, the technique that it's listed under is called system firmware. And until then, as I said, UEFI rootkits were mostly proof of concepts or reported capability of some government agencies or even the hacking team espionage software. But this was actually the first time that we actually saw it being used in the wild by malware. Okay, so let's move on to the second example, the second case study. This is predominantly research done by my colleague Anton Cherepanov. And in this case, I'm not going to be only talking about one piece of malware, but instead we're going to give a really nice overview of all the capability and all the different campaigns and the most interesting malware and techniques that this group has been using. So, Sandworm, as they're right now most popularly referred to, we haven't really been using that name because we track them with a more granular level, so tracking various clusters which then fall under this sort of umbrella term. There's also a book now about all these activities by Andy Greenberg titled Sandworm. It's a really good read, so if you haven't read it, I do encourage you to pick it up, where you can read the whole story about all this stuff that was happening mostly in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, because for a lot of the activity of these groups we saw in other countries as well, for example, Poland. So the first tooling, the first malware that we sort of started focusing on and were able to tie to this group was BlackEnergy. And BlackEnergy itself, it has a really interesting history where it went BlackEnergy version 1 being basically a cybercrime toolkit used for cybercrime, being modular, being used for denial of service attack and various other crimeware stuff, eventually evolving into this APT tool, but even still being basically a general purpose cyber weapon. So it was used in historically the first attacks against a power grid that resulted in a blackout caused by a cyber attack. But BlackEnergy, as I said, it gave the attackers access inside that critical network, inside the Ukrainians' power grid, the electricity distribution substations. It was a very well organized attack, and it was distributed. So different substations all across the country were targeted around the same time, and a lot of preparations went after. So the blackout itself was actually only the culmination of the attack, and many months of preparations and actually attempts to get inside were happening prior to this visible end effect that we saw. So BlackEnergy was used for initial access, it was used for lateral movement and all of those things, but the actual pulling the plug, the flipping of the switches, the circuit breakers, that was not done by BlackEnergy. That was done manually because the attackers were able to get access credentials to a remote access software called Radmin that the administrators of the Ukrainian power grid were actually using, because a lot of these substations are geographically very widespread, so they needed to have a capability to connect to these remotely. And they were able to do that. So in case there's anyone who hasn't seen this, this video, I'll play it for you. This was actually taken by one engineer at one of these substations. You can notice the up-to-date operating system that they were using there. And basically the purpose, the point of this video was to show, look, somebody is remotely manipulating the controls, flipping switches, and it's not me, I'm not touching the mouse or the keyboard.
І що, це другий раз пробую зробити з 110. А може це айтішники роблять?
Okay. So that blackout happened in December 2015. The group was also responsible for another Ukrainian power grid attack that happened almost exactly 1 year later in December 2016. But we were only able to confidently attribute it to this group later on, and I'll get to that in just a second. But we analyzed this malware, called it Industroyer, for the purpose that, in this case, the attack itself didn't have that much more of an impact compared to the year prior to that. It affected a transmission substation this time, not a distribution, but a transmission one. Station of North Kiev, so potentially targeting a larger region, but it was not distributed, so it was not multiple substations like the year before that. And the outage actually only lasted for an hour, which part of the reason for that could have been that the Ukrainians already had experience with dealing with this, and another reason being that the attackers basically failed in their attempt. But the point I'm trying to say is that this malware didn't really fill up its potential, because this time they were using a much more powerful malware framework than BlackEnergy. And not only was it more powerful, but it was very tailored and specifically designed to attack the power grid. And for all these reasons, we consider it to be one of the most cunning pieces of malware ever created, thanks to its modularity and to the capability to communicate with ICS, Industrial Control Systems equipment, using these industrial communication protocols, effectively bridging the gap between IT and OT attacks. Okay, let's continue with the timeline. I'll get back to the techniques used by Industroyer later. Then we sort of saw a shift of activity of this group to what we started calling Telebots, because there was some stuff in common. Some of their infrastructure was reused, but the malware was different. And they were using backdoors, which were using the Telegram API for command and control communication, hence the nickname. And also the focus, the targeting changed quite a bit. So it was still Ukraine. The ambition was to cripple operation throughout all over the country, but it was not going after the energy industry primarily. It was going after the financial sector mostly. So a lot of banks and also all other financial institutions, Ministry of Finance, Stock Exchange, and these types of targets were targeted by the Telebots subgroup, we can call it that, and their malware. They were also responsible for the infamous NotPetya attack that spread beyond the borders of Ukraine, and that was facilitated, that actually started the patient zero of that epidemic being the MEDOC backdoor, a backdoor basically distributed through the update mechanism of this widely used financial accounting software used all over the country. This other box I have here, Xeramel. So we only discovered that later on in April 2018, and this was the actual piece of evidence that we were missing that allowed us to connect Industroyer with this whole activity of this group. So we knew that Xeramel was the work of this Telebots subgroup due to the execution chains, due to malware similarities and other stuff like that. And that actually contained similarities. I'll get to GreyEnergy later. That contained code similarities, unique code similarities with Industroyer. So we have the Xeramel backdoor on the left, and we have the Industroyer main backdoor on the right. And we were able to conclude that yes, this is linked. I mean, before it was expected, even before we found this, and it was It was a claim or this was the opinion, the general opinion of the security community that this stuff is done by the same group, but no actual evidence was presented to support that fact. I mean, it made sense, right? I mean, if you have an attacker who attacks the Ukrainian power grid, causes a mass blackout, and then another year you have kind of the same effect, most probably they are related somehow, but at that time it was mostly a guess until we were able to find this piece of evidence. Okay, so there was also a parallel activity that actually started the first instances of GreyEnergy that we saw around the time that we saw the last instances of BlackEnergy. So for that reason, we consider GreyEnergy to kind of be the successor of the BlackEnergy subgroup or activity cluster. And basically taking place in parallel to the other subgroup of Telebots, which were primarily focusing on the financial sector. So yeah, GreyEnergy, they continued targeting the energy sector. And we'll talk a little bit more about GreyEnergy in just a second. So let's take a look at the techniques that this group was using, the most notable ones. For initial access, they mostly relied on spear phishing emails, and I guess that's unsurprising. Most APT groups do that, right? And they were employing various means to gain execution, whether various methods of pure social engineering or using exploits. CVE 2014-4014, ring a bell, anyone? Okay, so that's what later became known as the Sandworm vulnerability that Anton reported to Microsoft that later got patched. So that was being used to spread BlackEnergy around the second half of 2014. So yeah, they were using a 0-day. Some other interesting initial access techniques was the supply chain compromise, which I already hinted at. So that was the compromise of MEDOC, the most widely used financial software in Ukraine. The attackers managed to compromise basically the whole infrastructure of this company from their source code all the way to their update servers, and they abused the update server mechanism to push basically Trojan Eyes to push backdoored updates virtually to every business around the whole country, and then through this backdoor, through this MEDOC backdoor, they pushed the NotPetya epidemic. So that's the most widely known example of supply chain compromise, but that's not the only one. So that happened in June 2017, NotPetya there, but there were also other supply chain attacks used by this group that preceded it that were not that well covered. Another really interesting initial access technique, this time this was used by GreyEnergy, was gaining entry via vulnerable web servers. So they found a vulnerability in these web servers, and they kind of used it as a re-entry technique. So they first had to know that this vulnerability was there, and then they had it as a backup mechanism of getting in again, say after their malware was cleaned off from the network, from the systems. And some other really interesting techniques. For example, there were BlackEnergy plugins which were abusing TeamViewer, specific versions of TeamViewer for remote unattended access. So there was a special setting to virtually open up another backup backdoor that the attackers could use to gain entry into the network. There were also BlackEnergy plugins which acted as parasitic infectors. Now this is really interesting because we don't see these much nowadays, right? So parasitic infectors, viruses, that's something that we definitely don't encounter that much, and we were surprised to see that this malware was using this. Specifically, we found some Juniper installers which were infected using this particular plugin. Now, Are there any ICS folks in the audience? Some of you might recognize what this technique is about. So this one is execution via HMI. So this was also being used to launch, to install BlackEnergy. And specifically, that script would be opened by General Electric's Simplicity HMI, but there were also HMIs targeted like Symantec WinCC. So this was actually one of the first indicators of this group's interest in critical infrastructure and the energy sector, because all of this stuff was discovered, all this stuff happened before the blackout. And so that was the first example. Let's talk a little bit about what GreyEnergy, the latest evolution of this group's arsenal. So what this focus was about. As I said already, mostly energy companies, not exclusively, but mostly. They were targeting ICS control workstations, searching for some specific SCADA software. And a very curious observation, one that also indicated the group's targeting, was that some of the GreyEnergy samples we detected and analyzed were signed with a certificate from Advantech, a Taiwanese manufacturer of industrial and IoT hardware. So these were most likely stolen from the company, just as in the case of Stuxnet or with the recent more recent plead malware campaign. So some more interesting GreyEnergy techniques. For OPSEC, for staying under the cover, they didn't push all of their modules, so it was also modular. This is also kind of a signature thing for this group. They were only selectively pushing the modules, the plugins, to each target as needed. And all of these plugins, they use various levels of security, so they would encrypt their code, decrypt it, and for a lot of these samples, we were not able to even find out what exactly their functionality was because it was encrypted with a hardware-based key. They were using what I call internal CNC proxies, so basically using internal CNC servers with the first level of the CNC servers being without the compromised organization's network. And it also makes sense. I mean, it's less suspicious if one node is communicating outside to a malicious, the actual CNC server, rather than all of the infected nodes connecting to it directly. Now, those actual CNC servers, they also operated as Tor relays. This is also something that we saw commonly being used by this group, not only GreyEnergy, but also BlackEnergy before, also Industroyer. So all those CNC servers, most of them at least, were running Tor relays. So kind of an OPSEC requirement. The malware wasn't communicating with the CNCs via Tor, but we believe this was used for the attackers, for the malware operators, to connect and to get to the dump sites and to send commands and all of that stuff for anonymity. Okay, so let's talk about all the impact that I already kind of mentioned, kind of suggested, hinted. If I was to describe this group with just one word, I would definitely call them impactful. For the havoc they caused in Ukraine with their sabotage operations, which left hundreds of thousands of civilians without electricity for hours, as well as the NotPetya pseudo-ransomware that caused large-scale damage to some of the world's largest corporations. And when the damages were reported by those companies, Merck, Maersk, FedEx, and so on, it became to be known as the most damaging cyber attack in history. So I want to focus on Industroyer because it's probably the most unique piece of malware. And in that case, we're not mapping the activity to the regular MITRE ATT&CK matrix, because MITRE actually just recently released a matrix specifically for industrial control systems. So it's still kind of a work in progress, but there's a slightly different, slightly modified matrix with a little bit different tactics and slightly different techniques under those tactics, as like really being really specific to industrial control systems. So Industroyer is also featured there, and let's do a more high-level description of what it was capable of. So this is a substation, and we identified three main ways the Industroyer samples attacked these electricity distribution substations, or transmission in this case. So firstly, and most importantly, it could directly control the industrial hardware on site. So these types of boxes, protection relays, it could send commands to these devices. And it would do so using one of 4 industrial communication protocols. So these were embedded in Industroyer, being used as plugins. Now, Industroyer was abusing these protocols. There were no exploits involved, no software vulnerabilities in play, but you have to remember that all of these protocols were designed decades ago without security or without the notion in mind that all of this stuff would be connected remotely and exposed for remote and malicious access. So the second type of impact, in this case, vulnerabilities were in play here. And this was about rendering protection relays irresponsive. So this was exploiting a bug in Siemens software. It wasn't a 0-day, so it had patches available around the time that this was abused, but you can probably imagine the state of patching that these systems were at. It's a lot more difficult and a lot more problematic than in regular computer networks. So this was done by the denial of service component. Then there was a third type of payload functionality in the Industroyer samples we analyzed, and this was the data wiper module. Its purpose was to make recovery from the attack more difficult, basically to amplify the impact of the attack. It went not after that industrial hardware, not after those protection relays, but after the workstations used to configure them, monitoring the workstations running that SCADA software. It would search, it had a list of specific files belonging to SCADA software and processes. It would rewrite those, wipe them, and basically render the system unbootable. Kind of a nightmare scenario for the defenders. So speaking of these wipers, or these various destructive components, they are also kind of a signature technique of this group. While tracking them, we observed an evolution of these techniques too, from BlackEnergy plugins through standalone kill disk malware to destructive file encryptors masquerading as ransomware. The most infamous being NotPetya, of course. And most of Telebots' data wiper modules were focusing on Windows, but they also had samples targeting Linux servers. So in this case, the techniques would be data encrypted for impact, for example. And another technique, this was an image discovered by the employees of a specific Ukrainian institution one morning when they came to work. So a cultural reference, obviously the operators, the adversary was a fan of Mr. Robot. So I don't know how, we could call this a defacement, we could call it a prank, whatever. So that brings me to the end of the talk. This was kind of a trip down memory lane until now. But I have to say that all these adversaries are still active. We have been seeing their activity more or less, and we continue tracking them, and we will be releasing more information on them. Thank you.